Good morning, it's Monday the 30th of October in London. This is the Bloomberg Daybreak Europe podcast. I'm Caroline Hepker.
And I'm Stephen Carroll. Coming up today. Gunfire in Gaza. Israeli tanks and troops enter the Palestinian territory as geopolitical tensions rise.
Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu faces calls to step down over the 7th of October security failures.
Plus, negotiations go down under. Australia once again walks away from trade talks with the EU.
Let's start with a roundup of our top stories.
Israel sent troops and tanks into northern Gaza beginning this weekend in what Benjamin Netanyahu called the second stage of the war against Hamas. Meanwhile, a hospital where thousands are sheltering is facing an evacuation order because of Israeli raids nearby. Jason Lee, country director at Save the Children Palestine, says most people in the besieged territory have very little choice on where they can go.
There's still thousands of families, particularly with children with disabilities, that cannot access the shelters. There is nowhere that is safe in Gaza right now.
Jason Lee's comments come as the territory's health ministry, which is controlled by Hamas, says more than 8,000 people have been killed there. Bloomberg understands that Israel's military campaign inside Gaza is expected to last anywhere from 6 weeks to 6 months.
The military escalation comes as Israel's Prime Minister faces growing pressure from within the government to stand down. Benjamin Netanyahu caused controversy with a social media post at the weekend where he pointed the finger at intelligence chiefs for the country's biggest security lapse in decades. He later deleted the post and apologised. The criticism comes as Netanyahu addressed the nation, saying he is determined to avenge the October the 7th attack that killed 1,400 people. His words are spoken by a translator.
Our hero troops, they have one supreme main goal: to completely defeat the murderous enemy and to guarantee our existence in this country. We've always said, never again. Never again is now.
Benjamin Netanyahu also spoke on the telephone with President Joe Biden to discuss, quote, developments in Gaza. Meanwhile, in the US, House Republicans will this week vote on a bill to provide aid to Israel in a standalone bill worth some $14.5 billion.
Well, plans to pass that bill come as the United States said it sees an elevated risk of regional spillover from the war between Israel and Hamas. National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan warned this weekend that America will keep responding to any attacks on its troops by Iranian proxies. That's as Iran's foreign minister warned of a much wider war with America if the country maintains its unequivocal support for Israel. Here's what Hussein Amir Abdullahian told Bloomberg's Manus Cranney in New York on Friday.
The United States continues what it has been doing so far, then new fronts will be opened up against the United States.
That was Iran's foreign minister speaking via a translator, declining to detail the consequences the country may have in store. He also denied that Iran had instructed groups in Syria and Iraq to target US forces in recent days, saying the groups are acting independently and haven't received direction from Tehran.
Now, in other news this morning, HSBC has announced a $3 billion share buyback in its latest results. The bank reported pre-tax profits of $7.71 billion for the third quarter. That's less than the estimated $8.1 billion. Revenues from personal banking were boosted by higher interest rates, whilst trading revenues were weaker. HSBC also continues to be hit by China's real estate crisis, reporting a charge of $500 million for losses on commercial real estate in the country.
Australia has walked away from trade talks with the European Union for the second time in 3 months. The two sides have been working on a free trade agreement for more than 5 years. Bloomberg's Australia correspondent Paul Allen says while there's a broad consensus across most areas, the issue of agriculture now threatens to derail the entire deal.
As for what happens next, could be months, could be years before this gets done again. The Agriculture Minister Murray Wyatt saying that it might be until after the next federal election in Australia that this gets addressed, and that will be after 2025.
Paul Allen says both sides are still motivated to reach an agreement. For Australia, the centre-left Labour government needs a win after facing criticism by opposition figures for not focusing enough on the economy. Meanwhile, European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen needs a victory on trade after a missed attempt with the US to remove steel and aluminium tariffs.
Now to some UK news. House prices are declining in the overwhelming majority of the country, according to the latest data from the property portal Zoopla. The site says that 80% of local areas saw year-on-year price declines in September. Now that's up from about 5% only 6 months ago. The figures come as households face a barrage of pressures, including higher borrowing rates and a cost of living squeeze. Zoopla says it expects home sales to drop by almost a quarter this year before staying flat in 2024.
Those are your top stories on the markets. The MSCI Asia Pacific Index is 0.5% lower. Brent crude oil down 1.4% to $89.25 a barrel, and the 10-year Treasury yield is up 4 basis points at 4.88%.
Now we return to our top story. Israel has continued a ground invasion in Gaza that began on Saturday night, sending troops and tanks into the northern Gaza Strip in what is called the second and longer phase of its war against Hamas. Joining us now is Honor Ant, Bloomberg's Turkey Bureau Chief. Good morning, Honor. Thank you for your time. A ground invasion was widely expected by Israel. This looks to be a quite cautious start. What has been happening exactly? What do we know?
As you said, the ground operation was widely expected, and on Saturday, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu announced the beginning of the second phase of the war, which is basically the widely expected ground incursion. However, the incursion was expected to be, or is widely expected to be, a massive invasion of Gaza, whereas what happened in reality so far is more of a, I would call, surgical operation into Gaza, starting from the north. It looks like, unlike the war in 2014, Israel Defense Forces, that's Israel's military, is entering Gaza with tanks and other armored vehicles under air cover, heavy bombardment of northern Gaza. And they have so far been active in areas outside of urban centers. That was those who might have followed the 2014 war between the two might be able to recall. When they entered urban centers, there were serious attempts at attacking Israel Defense Forces by Hamas, and that resulted in, as far as I can remember, over 70 Israeli soldiers dead in just over 2 days, and Israel had abandoned that tactic. So this time around, it looks like Israeli tank battalions and other armed vehicles have kept their operations focused on areas outside of urban centers, while Israel, the Air Force, keeps airstrikes intensely focused on the northern third of Gaza Strip.
OK, so that's the situation as regards the military movements. Meanwhile, the Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu himself under pressure to resign over his unwillingness to accept responsibility for failing to anticipate the Hamas attack on October 7th. How much pressure is the Israeli Prime Minister under?
Well, the pressure was already great, but it definitely rose over the weekend when Benjamin Netanyahu posted a tweet that basically pointed fingers at the country's military and intelligence for failing to detect or predict the October 7 attacks by Hamas. He quickly deleted that comment later and apologized for it, and made an attempt to sort of unify the nation at this difficult time for them. But that post definitely led to increased criticism of Netanyahu, how he's been handling the security situation, and for over what many believe is his own failure to keep Israel safe from Hamas attacks in light of the October 7 attack.
What, Honor, is happening to Palestinian civilians? Calls for much more aid, for much more help. What do we know of the situation with Palestinian civilians?
The situation in Gaza, especially in the south, where people have been told to evacuate to by Israel Defense Forces, dire, to say the least. Yesterday, UNRWA, the UN relief agency that's active in Gaza, said its warehouses that contained basic food items such as wheat and flour and oil, cooking oil, were ransacked by hundreds, if not thousands, of Palestinians simply because they are afraid they don't have food and they wanted to feed their children. So there are emerging signs that law and order is collapsing. Civil order is collapsing in Gaza, especially in the south, where people were told would be safe from Israeli airstrikes. So in an attempt to mitigate that, regional power brokers, the US, European powers have been urging Israel and Egypt to do more to allow more humanitarian aid into Gaza through the Rafah crossing. That's the border crossing between Gaza Strip and Egypt. However, as of last night, the number of trucks that entered Gaza Strip, 8 trucks entered Gaza Strip over the past week or so, was just over 115. To put it in context, before the war started, the number of trucks that entered Gaza, including obviously commercial sales, not just humanitarian aid, before the war was about 500 trucks per day. So as UN and other international organizations have said over the past week, roughly 2 to 4% of daily needs of Gaza are now being allowed in through Rafah crossing in terms of humanitarian aid, and that's just exacerbating the humanitarian cost of this war to civilians in Gaza Strip.
Okay, Honor, thank you so much for bringing us up to date with that. That's Honor Ant, who's Bloomberg's Turkey Bureau Chief, following the latest developments from the Middle East this morning for us.
Well, after spending years building up soft power, Qatar's clout has been put to the test in this Israel-Hamas war. The small Gulf nation has a $475 billion sovereign wealth fund and is home to the Doha-based broadcaster Al Jazeera, and it seems has become a pivotal player. Joining us now to discuss, Sylvia Westall, who's on Bloomberg's Big Take, which today examines what has happened after the 7th of October attack. Good morning, Sylvia. How did Qatar, which has relations with Hamas, the Taliban in Afghanistan, but also the United States and Israel, become a go-between?
Yeah, so Qatar's really sought diplomatic influence with everyone. It's had these sort of on-off trade ties with Israel since 1996, which was very unusual at the time, although it doesn't have formal diplomatic relations with Israel. And yes, as you've mentioned, it has these, it liaises with the Taliban in Afghanistan, it hosted them in exile, and it helped mediate the release of American prisoners from Iran. And then it also has these ties which have become very important in the negotiation of the release of hostages that were seized by Hamas during their attack on Israel on October 7th. So it positions itself as this go-between, and it's done that really because it's this, very small state in the Middle East. It's sandwiched between Iran and Saudi Arabia. It needs to try and maintain relations with lots of different groups. Unlike some of its peers, it's done that by having connections with groups and with groups, that are hostile and that play off against each other. So it's had this position, and now in this moment, it's positioning itself as this negotiator at this very critical time.
Well, what role has it played since October 7th when it comes to the hostages in Gaza?
So 4 of the hostages held by Hamas in Gaza have been released, and Qatar was involved in those negotiations. There was an American mother and a daughter, and then 2 elderly Israeli women who are both released. But it's really a tiny fraction of the hostages that are believed held in Gaza. The Israeli government puts the number at more than 200. So it's having to have this very tricky role, talking to, hitting the phones when this happened with its contacts through Hamas, also reaching out to Israel and being in touch with the Americans and other countries which have foreign nationals being held in Gaza.
And yet, what do you think are going to be the pressure points and Qatar's role in the next few weeks? Because the country is under pressure to show Western allies it can step up. It's also accused of cozying up to Iran. So, perhaps a pivotal role. But what pressure points will it be under?
Absolutely. So I think, one of the reasons that Qatar's role has caused real frictions in the region is that it has got these links, which other countries such as, the UAE and Saudi Arabia to a certain extent say encourage these groups. This role right now, Qatar's trying to present itself as being a useful and reliable partner and having a place at the table with much bigger powers in terms of being an international power broker. But it's come under a lot of criticism. We spoke to Dennis Ross, who served as the White House Middle East envoy under Bill Clinton. He said that Qatar can't have it both ways. They can't say they're the bridge, and then no shines they can actually influence Hamas, and particularly its military wing in Gaza. And so there's real pressure on them now to get more hostages out, and Qatar needs to deliver to show that by maintaining all these links, it actually serves a purpose rather than encouraging more violence.
This is Bloomberg Daybreak Europe, your morning brief on the stories making news from London to Wall Street and beyond.
Look for us on your podcast feed every morning on Apple, Spotify and anywhere else you get your podcasts.
You can also listen live each morning on London DAB Radio, the Bloomberg Business app and Bloomberg.com.
Our flagship New York station is also available on your Amazon Alexa devices. Just say, Alexa, play Bloomberg 1130. I'm Caroline Hepker.
And I'm Stephen Carroll. Join us again tomorrow morning for all the news you need to start your day, right here on Bloomberg Daybreak Europe.